The knock on my door came just as I was pouring myself a late cup of coffee. The kind of knock that isn't polite or hesitant but sharp, impatient, as if whoever was standing on the other side believed they had every right to barge into my life uninvited. When I opened it, my parents stood there, faces tight, voices already raised before a single greeting passed between us. "You have to sell your house," my father announced as if it were the most logical sentence in the world. "Your sister is drowning in $150,000 of debt, and it's time you finally gave something back to this family." For a moment, I just stared at them, stunned, because this wasn't a family that had ever asked me to give. Not since the day they cut me out of their lives 5 years ago like I was disposable. That morning came rushing back to me. How my name was erased from group chats. How I wasn't invited to holidays anymore. How I was told in no uncertain terms that I was on my own and should stop expecting help. I had taken those words seriously, built my own life brick by brick, and now here they were demanding that the very bricks I had laid down be ripped apart for someone else's mistakes. I remember gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white, thinking about the absurdity of it all, how they had made me a ghost in my own bloodline, and now that a crisis had landed on their golden child's shoulders, suddenly I wasn't invisible anymore. I could feel the heat rising in my chest as I asked them, "Why should I lose everything I built just because you refused to hold her accountable?" But they weren't listening. They never really listened. Instead, my mother's eyes swept past me, looking into the hallway of my home as if she were already measuring what could be taken and sold. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't just about debt. It was about control, about reminding me that in their eyes I was still the daughter who owed them, no matter how much they had abandoned me. And that realization, sharp and cold, was the exact moment I knew I would not give them what they wanted. Not this time. Not ever. I shut the door in their faces that day. But of course it didn't end there, because my parents have never been the type to take no quietly. Within 24 hours, my phone lit up with messages, each one more aggressive than the last. My mother writing that I had a moral obligation to step in, my father reminding me of all. The times they had put food in my mouth and clothes on my back, as though that basic parenting counted as a debt I'd carried into adulthood. Then came the phone calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Aunts and cousins, and even my godmother parroting the same line. Family helps family. What none of them mentioned was how, 5 years earlier, when my life had fallen apart and I'd begged them for help, no one had lifted a finger. I remembered how I sat in my tiny rented apartment back then, crying into the silence of unanswered calls, while my sister posted photos from vacations my parents had happily funded. That sister, the one they now wanted me to rescue, had been the reason I was cut out in the first place. She had lied about me, twisted every story to paint me as selfish, ungrateful, and difficult until my parents chose her version of reality over mine. I was exiled, told I was toxic, while she continued to bask in their approval. And now here I was, standing in a home I had worked 2 jobs to buy, facing the expectation that I would give it all up so she could climb out of the hole she'd dug with shopping sprees, failed business schemes, and reckless credit cards. As their messages piled up, I thought about how many times I had driven past their house in those 5 years, telling myself I no longer cared, trying to convince myself I was fine without them. But the truth was, I did care. I cared enough to feel every word they hurled at me like a reopened wound. I cared enough that when they showed up at my door, part of me still wanted to be accepted, to be seen. Yet I also felt something else, something stronger than longing, rage that after all their abandonment, they dared to appear only when they wanted to strip me of what I had built. That rage kept me steady as I opened my laptop and began to document everything. Their texts, their voicemails, even the bank records I still had that proved my sister's mess was entirely hers. I wasn't sure yet what I would do with it all, but a part of me knew this battle wouldn't be fought just with words at my doorstep. It would end somewhere far more formal, and for once, I was ready to let the truth speak louder than their guilt. The escalation came faster than I anticipated. Within a week, I was served with a letter, not from a lawyer, but from my parents themselves, typed out in stiff formal language they must have copied from the internet. It accused me of being ungrateful and deliberately obstructive to the survival of my family unit. They demanded that I liquidate my house for the benefit of your sister's financial recovery, and warned that if I refused, the consequences will be on your head. I laughed bitterly when I read it, because what consequences could they possibly enforce? They had no legal claim to my home, but it wasn't about legality for them. It was about shame, pressure, and manipulation, tools they had wielded my entire childhood. They wanted me to crack under the weight of guilt. What they didn't realize was that 5 years of silence had hardened me into someone they no longer recognized. Still, I wasn't prepared for what came next. My sister herself showed up at my door one evening, mascara streaked down her face, her voice trembling in what I could tell was a carefully practiced display. She cried about the collectors calling her day and night, about how her credit was destroyed, about how her future was ruined. "Please," she whispered, clutching my arm. "You don't understand what it's like to be in this position." I pulled away from her and reminded her that I had been in worse positions, alone. Abandoned, scraping together enough money just to eat while she had been in Cancun, drinking cocktails paid for by our parents. Her tears dried up quickly after that, replaced with the same cold sneer I remembered from childhood, the one that said she believed she was superior, that she was untouchable. "They'll never forgive you if you don't do this," she hissed. "And when they're gone, don't think you'll see a dime of their estate." That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't a plea, it was blackmail. They had all banded together not because they loved me, but because I was useful, a last resort safety net. And the threat of being cut out of an inheritance I had already been denied years ago meant nothing to me. I told her as much, watching her face twist in shock when I said calmly, "I'd rather lose every penny of their money than lose myself again." She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled, but I didn't flinch. I had already begun drafting my response, a legal one this time. Because if they wanted to drag me into a fight, I was going to meet them not with tears or guilt, but with documentation, facts, and boundaries they couldn't bend. And deep down, I knew the moment this reached a courtroom, the masks they'd worn for so long would begin to crack. It didn't take long before the courtroom became the stage they had forced us onto. My parents sat on one side, stiff and righteous, my sister beside them with a carefully chosen outfit that screamed innocence. I sat alone on the other, a single folder of documents in front of me. But inside that folder was every receipt, every screenshot, every voicemail that painted a very different picture than the one they had rehearsed. Their attorney tried to spin a beat story of family duty, claiming that I had benefited from my parents' sacrifices, and now it was my turn to step up. But when the judge asked for proof of any financial agreement or debt tying me to my sister, there was nothing, only the hollow weight of their accusations. That was when I slid my folder across the table, my hands steady as I watched the bailiff deliver it to the bench. Page after page revealed the truth. The credit card statements in my sister's name showing vacations, designer purchases, failed business ventures. The text messages where my parents openly acknowledged cutting me off, telling me I was no longer their responsibility. The voicemails where they demanded my money now that her life was unraveling. The judge's expression shifted as he read, from neutral to something almost incredulous, as if even he couldn't believe the audacity of what they had tried to pull. My sister squirmed in her seat, whispering furiously to my mother, while my father glared at me with a hatred that could have burned a hole through the wall. But I didn't look away. For once, I held my ground, silent and unflinching, as the narrative they had built crumbled in real time. When the judge finally spoke, his words were clear, cutting through the courtroom like a knife. "There is no legal basis for this demand. This case is dismissed." The sound of the gavel echoed, final and absolute, and in that moment, the years of manipulation, abandonment, and shame seemed to collapse under its weight. My parents sat frozen, speechless, while my sister covered her face with her hands. And I, after years of being silenced, erased, and blamed, felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Vindication. But even then, I knew this wasn't the end. Families like mine don't walk away quietly, and I had no doubt they would find new ways to try and claw their way back into my life. What they didn't know was that I was no longer the girl they could cut out and expect to come crawling back. I was the woman who had finally learned how to lock the door and never open it again. After the dismissal, I thought maybe that would be enough to make them stop, that a judge's word would finally silence their endless demands. But if anything, it only seemed to ignite their fury. Within days, my mother was on social media, spinning stories about me being heartless, painting herself as the selfless mother abandoned by her ungrateful daughter. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in a decade suddenly messaged me, saying things like, "Your poor parents, they gave you everything and this is how you repay them?" It was like watching a wildfire spread, but instead of smoke, it was lies choking the air. I wanted to scream, to defend myself publicly, but I knew better. Shouting into their echo chamber would only make me look guilty. Instead, I stayed quiet, documenting everything. Screenshots of posts, copies of messages, even the one time my father left a voicemail threatening to show up and take what's ours if I didn't reconsider. That last one was the final push I needed to file for a restraining order. It felt surreal, standing in front of another judge, this time explaining why my own parents needed to be legally barred from contacting me. But when I played that voicemail aloud in court, hearing his voice booming through the speakers with raw entitlement, the room went dead silent. The judge didn't hesitate. An order of protection was granted that same day, and suddenly the tables had turned. No more late-night pounding at my door, no more harassing calls. Legally, they couldn't come near me. Yet even with that barrier, the emotional fallout was enormous. Friends of the family cut me off, neighbors whispered. Even a few co-workers asked quietly if it was true that I had turned my back on my blood. It hurt, of course it did, but with every rumor that reached me, I felt my resolve harden. For so long, I had carried the shame of being unwanted, of being the daughter left behind. Now, for the first time, I realized that shame was never mine to carry. It belonged to them. They were the ones who had abandoned me. They were the ones who had tried to strip me of everything I built, and now they were the ones branded by court records that showed their schemes. I looked around at the walls of my house, the home I had fought so hard to keep, and I swore to myself that I would never again let them or anyone else try to take it away. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about finally, fully claiming my life as mine. The silence that followed was almost eerie. For years, my life had been filled with their noise, their criticisms, their demands, their endless commentary on everything I did wrong. And now, after the restraining order, all I heard was quiet. No more buzzing phone at midnight, no more knocks at my door, no more distant relatives parroting guilt trips. Just silence. At first, it was unsettling. I found myself listening for the chaos, waiting for the next shoe to drop. But slowly, the quiet began to feel like freedom. I could breathe in my own home without worrying that someone would try to take it from me. I could pour my morning coffee without remembering my father's voice ordering me to sell it all. And yet, even in the stillness, the memories lingered. I thought back to when I was little, to birthdays where my sister got everything she asked for while I smiled over second-hand gifts, to dinners where my achievements were brushed aside while hers were celebrated like trophies. I realized that this fight over my house wasn't new. It was the final chapter in a book they'd been writing my whole life, where I was always the expendable one, the one meant to sacrifice so others could shine. But this time I had rewritten the ending. They couldn't take my home, my money, or my peace. That power was gone forever. One evening, as the sun set through the windows I had cleaned with my own hands, I sat on the couch and let myself feel it fully. Not just the relief, but the pride. I had stood up to them and won. I had chosen myself, even when it meant standing alone. And in that choice, I found a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The funny thing was, I didn't feel like I had lost a family. I felt like I had finally walked away from strangers who had been masquerading as one. And in their place, I was free to build a new kind of family, the kind made of friends who showed up without strings, of people who clapped for me without envy, of relationships rooted in respect instead of obligation. I knew my parents and sister would go on spinning their stories, but I also knew those stories no longer had the power to define me. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I was the one holding the pen. It was around the time I finally allowed myself to breathe that something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in my mailbox. Not from my parents or my sister, but from an attorney handling my grandparents' estate. My heart sank at first. I was sure this was their new attempt to circle back into my life through money and manipulation. But when I opened the envelope, what I read shocked me. My grandparents had quietly left me a portion of their estate, a portion my parents had clearly not expected me to see. It wasn't massive, not the kind of inheritance that changes your life overnight, but it was enough to feel like recognition, like someone in my bloodline had seen me after all. The letter confirmed what I already knew in my bones. My parents had tried to erase me, but the truth had left its mark. When I showed the document to my lawyer, she explained that my parents would almost certainly contest it, but that the will was airtight. I could already imagine their outrage when they found out. The daughter they had cut off, shamed, and demanded to sacrifice was now legally entitled to something they couldn't take away. The irony was almost poetic. I thought back to my sister's threats at my doorstep, how she'd hissed that I would never see a dime of the family estate if I didn't fall in line. And here it was, not because of her or them, but because my grandparents had chosen it that way. In that moment, I understood something deeper. My fight hadn't just been about saving my house. It had been about proving, if only to myself, that I was worthy of holding on to what I had built. The inheritance was symbolic. It wasn't about the money, it was about validation. Proof that my existence couldn't be erased no matter how hard they tried. And instead of feeling bitter that it had come too late to repair the fractures, I felt a strange kind of peace. My grandparents had seen me. The courts had seen me. Most importantly, I had finally seen myself. As I folded the letter back into the envelope, I realized the war was over, not because my parents had surrendered, but because I had chosen to stop fighting for a place at their table and build my own instead. When the news of the inheritance finally reached my parents, I didn't need to hear their voices to know their rage. It arrived in the form of a distant cousin's voicemail, dripping with venom, warning me that I had ruined the family and would regret it when everyone turned their backs on you. I deleted it without a second thought. For once, I wasn't rattled by their fury. The money itself wasn't life-changing, but the symbolism was. It meant my grandparents hadn't bought into the narrative that I was disposable, and that knowledge was more valuable than any check. I used part of the inheritance to pay down the last of my mortgage, something my parents never thought I'd own in the first place, and when I signed the papers finalizing it, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. My house was no longer just a shelter. It was proof that I had survived without them, thrived even, and now I owned it free and clear. Meanwhile, my sister continued to spiral. Word spread quietly through extended family that her debts were only getting worse, that collectors were circling, that she might even be facing bankruptcy. For years, I would have twisted myself up with guilt over that, wondering if I should help, wondering if her downfall would somehow stain me too. But now, I didn't feel a flicker of obligation. Her choices were hers, just as mine had been mine. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't vindictive. I was simply done carrying burdens that were never meant for me. I thought back to all the times my parents said, "Family helps family," and realized what they'd really meant was, "You help us, and we take." That was never family, not really. Family was supposed to be love without price tags, support without contracts. What they had built was a transaction, and I had finally stopped paying the bill. Standing in my kitchen that night, lights glowing warm across the counters I had scrubbed with my own hands, I raised a glass of wine to myself. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for their approval or dreading their disapproval. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, untouched, unbroken, and undeniably free. The weeks that followed felt almost surreal, like stepping into a version of life I had once believed was out of reach. Without the constant barrage of threats, demands, and manipulations, I began to rediscover the smallest joys that had been buried under years of fear. I planted flowers in the yard I almost lost, watched them bloom with a stubborn beauty that mirrored my own survival. I invited friends over for dinner, people who laughed with me without keeping score, who asked how I was doing and actually listened. For so long, gatherings had been a minefield of comparisons and criticisms. Now they were filled with warmth and light. Still, there were moments when the echoes of my parents' voices tried to creep back in. I'd catch myself bracing for judgment as I set a plate down or apologized too quickly when I didn't need to. Those scars don't disappear overnight. But each time I reminded myself that I wasn't living in their house anymore. I was living in mine. The difference was everything. News of my sister's collapse trickled in through whispers I couldn't avoid. She'd filed for bankruptcy, lost her apartment, even had to sell her car. My parents had downsized, forced to shoulder debts they once assumed someone else would clean up. I didn't gloat. I didn't cheer. Instead, I felt a kind of grim clarity. Their empire of favoritism and entitlement had finally caved in on itself. All I had done was refuse to be the foundation they built it on. One night, sitting alone on my porch, I thought about the little girl I used to be, the one who begged for approval, who twisted herself into knots trying to earn a sliver of love that was always given away to someone else. I wished I could reach back in time, take her by the hand and whisper, "One day you'll understand. One day you'll walk away and never look back." That thought didn't bring sadness. It brought strength. Because the truth was, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, fully and unapologetically, in a life that was mine alone. It was around then that something shifted deep inside me. For years I had carried this invisible weight, a quiet ache that whispered maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe they were right to discard me. Maybe I really was the selfish one. But watching their carefully constructed world unravel while mine stood stronger than ever forced me to confront the truth I had long avoided. I had never been the problem. I had been the scapegoat, the convenient target, the one they could strip of dignity to keep their golden child elevated. Seeing it clearly was both devastating and liberating. I cried that night, not because I wanted them back, but because I finally allowed myself to grieve what I never truly had, a family that loved me unconditionally. Once the tears passed, I felt lighter, almost unshackled. That grief turned into resolve. I started therapy again, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to keep growing. Week by week, I peeled back the layers of guilt they had wrapped me in and learned how to trust my own instincts again. My therapist asked me once, "Do you realize how extraordinary it is that you didn't just survive their betrayal? You built a life in spite of it?" And for the first time in my life, I could answer honestly, yes, I do. Meanwhile, I kept the inheritance funds tucked safely away, not flaunting them, not using them to prove anything to anyone. They weren't a trophy. They were a quiet reminder that the truth always finds its way through, no matter how much someone tries to bury it. My parents stopped trying to contact me after the restraining order, but sometimes I'd see their names pop up in family group posts or holiday updates. I no longer felt the sting. They had their world, built on denial and favoritism, and I had mine, built on hard work and boundaries. And mine was the one still standing. As I closed the curtains of my home one evening, looking around at the space I had fought tooth and nail to protect, I realized something profound. The house wasn't just four walls. It was the proof that I had chosen myself, again and again, until the noise of their demands faded into nothing but silence. And in that silence, I found my freedom. By the time the leaves began to turn that year, I had grown into a rhythm that felt unshakable. The house that once felt like a battlefield now breathed peace into me. Every corner carried the weight of resilience rather than fear. I hosted a small gathering one evening, friends who had become my chosen family, filling the rooms with laughter and warmth. Someone raised a glass and toasted to me, saying, "Here's to standing your ground." and I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who celebrated me without taking, who loved me without conditions. Meanwhile, my parents and sister had faded into little more than background noise. Occasionally, someone would mention them in passing, like a distant headline about people I used to know. I learned my sister had taken on yet another doomed venture, trying to claw her way back to the lifestyle she believed she was entitled to, while my parents, weighed down by her failures, had sold off parts of what they once bragged about owning. The irony didn't escape me. After years of telling me I would never make it without them, it was I who stood solid while their empire crumbled piece by piece. I didn't rejoice in their downfall, but I didn't mourn it either. It simply wasn't mine to carry. Therapy had helped me untangle one of the hardest truths. Sometimes blood doesn't make you family, and sometimes walking away is the most loving act you can give yourself. That realization freed me from the last threads of guilt that had clung to me like cobwebs. On the anniversary of the day they had first cut me out, I lit a candle in my living room, not for them, but for me. A quiet ritual of survival, a promise to the younger version of myself who had once felt so alone. I stood there in the glow, looking around at the life I had built, and whispered aloud, "You did it. You made it home." And in that moment, I knew that no demand, no threat, no manipulation could ever take it from me again. The winter that followed brought with it a kind of clarity I had never experienced before. The holidays used to be the hardest time of year for me, scrolling past photos of my family gathered around a tree I wasn't invited to sit under, forcing a smile while coworkers asked about my plans. But this year was different. I decorated my own tree, strung lights across my porch, and invited friends who had no place to go. We cooked, we laughed, we stayed up late telling stories, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything. I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. There were no backhanded compliments, no comparisons, no subtle digs meant to remind me of my place. Just warmth, just love, just peace. Around that same time, I learned that my parents had stopped speaking to several relatives who questioned them about the court cases and the restraining order. Their circle was shrinking, their grip slipping, while mine was growing stronger by the day. I began volunteering at a local shelter on weekends, using my time and a small portion of my inheritance to help people who actually needed it. People who were grateful, who never once acted entitled to my sacrifice. It was a choice that filled me with a sense of purpose my family had never given me. Standing there, handing out warm meals to strangers who smiled with genuine appreciation, I realized something life-changing. I didn't need their version of family. I had built my own, and it was more real than anything I had ever known. The bitterness I once carried started to dissolve, replaced not with forgiveness for them, but with acceptance for myself. I could acknowledge what had happened, honor the pain it caused, and still refuse to let it define me. That was the greatest revenge of all, not anger, not retaliation, but living fully, joyfully, in a life untouched by their demands. As snow fell outside my window that December, I curled up in front of my fireplace, wine in hand, and finally felt it settle in my bones. I had won, not in a courtroom, not in arguments, but in the simple act of choosing peace over chaos, and that victory was mine forever. By the time the new year arrived, it felt like I had stepped into an entirely different chapter of my life. The drama that once consumed every corner of my mind had quieted into nothing more than a dull echo, and in its place was something I had long believed was impossible for me: stability. I woke up in the mornings without dread, brewed coffee in a kitchen that finally felt like home, and walked through rooms that no longer carried the weight of battles fought, but the warmth of a sanctuary earned. I had even started dating again, cautiously, carefully, allowing myself to trust someone new without the shadow of my family's betrayal hovering over every word. It wasn't about filling a void. It was about choosing connection on my own terms, no longer out of desperation, but from a place of strength. Still, there were reminders of the past. Every so often, a letter would arrive from my parents' address, though it was intercepted by the order of protection and never made its way into my hands. My lawyer said they were trying in vain to contest the inheritance, but each attempt was swatted down just as quickly as it appeared. Knowing they were still out there, still plotting, should have unnerved me. But instead, it fueled a quiet satisfaction. Their obsession with me was proof that I had taken back the one thing they feared most: control. My sister, on the other hand, had all but disappeared from public view. Her social media accounts were silent, her name whispered only in pity by extended relatives. I wondered sometimes if she hated me more for refusing to rescue her, or for surviving in spite of her sabotage. Either way, her silence was its own kind of closure. One evening, I walked through my neighborhood, the air crisp, the sky painted in streaks of pink and gold. Passing neighbors greeted me by name, smiling, and I realized how different it felt to be seen not as an outcast, not as the family scapegoat, but simply as myself. That's when it struck me. My revenge had never been about destroying them. It had always been about refusing to let them destroy me. And standing there under the fading light, breathing in the cold, clean air of a life finally free, I knew with absolute certainty that I had won in the only way that mattered. Spring came, and with it a sense of renewal I hadn't felt in years. The garden I had planted in defiance the year before began to bloom again, each flower a small reminder that life grows even in the harshest conditions if you give it the chance. I would sit on the porch in the mornings, coffee warming my hands, watching the tulips sway gently in the breeze, and I thought about how different my life felt now compared to the chaos of just a year ago. Back then, I had been bracing for the next attack, always on edge, always wondering when the hammer would fall. Now, I was steady, whole, unapologetically mine. There were still traces of them, rumors, occasional whispers through relatives who hadn't picked sides. Some said my parents barely left their downsized home anymore, ashamed by the outcome of the court cases. Others said my sister was working odd jobs, living paycheck to paycheck, still waiting for a miracle that would never come. I didn't revel in their struggles, but neither did I feel guilty. Their paths were shaped by choices, just as mine had been. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what it meant to let go. Not wishing them harm, not yearning for reconciliation, just releasing them entirely from my future. I wasn't carrying their burdens anymore, and in that release I had space to breathe, to dream. I started writing again, something I had abandoned years ago when their voices were too loud in my head. Late at night, with candles flickering on my desk, I poured my story onto paper, not for them, not even for the world, but for me. To see in black and white the truth I had lived through, the battles I had fought, and the strength I had found. And as the words filled the page, I felt another kind of healing, deeper than the silence, deeper than the court victories. I was reclaiming the narrative of my life, chapter by chapter, one sentence at a time. By summer, the transformation in my life was undeniable. My days were no longer measured by survival or defense, but by growth. I renovated parts of my home, not out of necessity, but because I wanted to. Fresh paint on the walls, new shelves in the living room, a cozy reading nook by the window. It felt symbolic, like I was building layer upon layer of proof that this life was mine, untouched by the demands of people who once thought they owned me. Friends joked that my house had become the safe place in our circle, the one where everyone gathered when they needed comfort, and that title filled me with pride. My parents' absence was no longer a wound, it was a blessing. The inheritance they had sworn I would never see had quietly secured my independence, and their attempts to claw it back had dissolved into failure after failure. Once upon a time, that knowledge would have fueled bitterness, but now it only fueled clarity. They had defined themselves through control, and when they lost that control, they lost me. My sister's name still surfaced now and then. Someone spotted her working retail. Another claimed she was borrowing money from distant relatives. But each mention felt like hearing about a stranger. She no longer had power over me. Her choices no longer dictated my peace. One evening, I sat in my yard watching fireflies spark against the twilight. and it struck me how far I had come. For years, I had fought for scraps of validation, believing that my worth depended on the approval of people who thrived on belittling me. But here, in the stillness of my own hard-won sanctuary, I saw the truth. My worth had always been mine to claim. Their debt, their demands, their drama, it all belonged to them. My freedom belonged to me. And with that realization, I knew this wasn't just survival anymore. This was a new beginning, one I had carved out of the ashes they left behind, one no one could ever take away again. As autumn rolled back around, it felt like the closing of a full circle. 1 year since they had pounded on my door demanding I sell my house. 1 year since the courtroom revealed their lies. 1 year since I drew the hardest line I had ever drawn. I walked through my home that morning and touched the walls, the doorknobs, the windowsills, remembering how close I had come to losing it all. Not because of my own mistakes, but because of theirs. And yet here I was, stronger, freer, untouchable in ways they could never have imagined. My parents and sister had become ghosts in my story. I no longer checked for updates, no longer braced myself for the next attack. They existed somewhere out there, orbiting each other in the wreckage of their own choices, but they were no longer my gravity. My life was pulled by something else now: joy, peace, purpose. I published the memoir I had been writing late at night, the one that told my truth in my words. It wasn't a bestseller, but it reached people who needed it. Messages poured in from strangers who had survived similar families, thanking me for giving voice to the pain they had buried. That, more than anything, became my closure, not revenge, not even vindication, but the knowledge that my survival could light the way for someone else stumbling through the dark. On the evening of the anniversary, I hosted a small dinner with the people I now called family. We laughed until our stomachs hurt, toasted not just to me but to resilience, to boundaries, to new beginnings. When the last guest left and the house was quiet again, I stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool, the stars sharp against the black sky. I took a deep breath and whispered into the silence, "I am free." And in that moment, I understood that this was the final chapter, not of my life, but of the story they once tried to write for me. I had closed the book on them forever, and in its place I had begun a new one, written entirely in my own hand. Looking back now, I realized the greatest shift wasn't just that I kept my house or that the court sided with me. It was that I had finally stepped out of the shadow they spent years trying to trap me in. For so long I believed their narrative, that I was the difficult one, the selfish one, the daughter who owed them endlessly simply for being born. They weaponized that story every chance they got, and I carried it like chains I couldn't shake. But standing here, a year later, I see those chains for what they really were: illusions. Their power existed only as long as I believed in it. Once I stopped, it all shattered. The house became more than walls and a roof. It became proof of resilience, of every long night I worked, every bill I paid, every quiet moment where I chose to keep going despite the silence they left me in. When I first turned the key in the door years ago, I thought I was only buying property. What I didn't realize was that I was claiming something much bigger, my independence. And when they tried to take it, they underestimated how fiercely I would fight for it. My parents' downfall wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost pitiful. Their social circle thinned, their voices no longer carried the weight they once did, and their golden child lost her shine. The same relatives who once scolded me began to soften, some even reaching out with half-hearted apologies. But by then I didn't need their validation. Their opinions had no currency in my life anymore. My worth was no longer measured by their approval. Even my sister, her name used to ignite a storm in me, the jealousy, the betrayal, the ache of being overlooked. Now it barely registered. She was just another person who made her choices and faced her consequences. The power she held over me had dissolved like smoke in the air. What surprised me most, though, was the peace that came when I finally stopped wishing things could have been different. For years, I longed for them to change, for an apology, for some gesture that proved I mattered. But peace didn't arrive when they changed. It arrived when I no longer needed them to. That was the freedom I had been chasing all along, the kind no court ruling or inheritance could ever give me. I created it by walking away, by holding my ground, by refusing to let them rewrite my story one more time. Now, as I look at my life, I don't see a tale of loss or estrangement. I see survival, reclamation, and quiet triumph. And maybe that is the sweetest form of revenge. Not anger, not bitterness, but living so fully and freely that their attempts to diminish me become irrelevant footnotes in a much larger story. The final lesson came to me not in a courtroom, not in an argument, but in the stillness of an ordinary morning. I woke early, sunlight spilling softly through the curtains, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air. I walked barefoot across the hardwood floors of the home they once tried to strip away from me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of the past lift completely. This house wasn't just a place I fought to keep. It was a monument to my refusal to be erased. Every wall carried echoes of my strength. Every window opened onto a view of a life I had built with no one's permission but my own. And as I stood there, mug warming my hands, I realized something so simple yet so profound. I was no longer defined by them. Not by their rejection, not by their manipulation, not by the scars they left behind. I was defined by my choice to rise anyway. For years, I had imagined revenge as something sharp and dramatic, a final showdown, a moment where they finally admitted I was right. But now I understood that true revenge was quieter, deeper. It was found in the laughter of friends gathered around my table, in the pages of the book I had written that touched strangers' lives, in the peace of falling asleep at night without fear of their next demand. They had tried to make me small, but I had grown larger than their reach. They had tried to silence me, but I had found my voice. They had tried to cut me out, but I had carved out a life so rich they no longer had a place in it. As autumn leaves swirled outside and the year drew to a close, I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, crisp, filled with the scent of wood smoke from nearby homes. I breathed it in deeply, and with that breath came the final acceptance. I owed them nothing. Not my house, not my money, not my forgiveness. Nothing. My life was mine, fully and completely, and no one could take it from me again. I whispered into the quiet, words meant only for myself, but powerful all the same. I survived you, and I am free. Then I closed the door, not in anger, but in peace, knowing I had already written the ending they never saw coming. And in that ending, I didn't just keep my home. I kept myself